And welcome to SaaS Bites. This is your weekly bite of SaaS during your lunch break. I'm your host, Micah Godbolt. You can follow us on, I'm telling my lower third today, you can follow us on Twitter at Micah Godbolt or at SaaS Bites to catch up with us. Catch our previous episodes at youtube.com/SaaSbites. Things are looking a little different today and maybe hopefully looking better today. I'm trying out a new basic process for casting with an app called Wirecast, which is like a local app that does all the compression and then pushes up the video directly to YouTube. So hopefully it's actually working. But what it also means is I've got transitions from shot to shot, hopefully be able to bring other audio elements and video elements into it, all that kind of stuff, a little bit more of a professional setup. So hopefully it works this time. But let's go ahead and jump into what we're going to do today. Watch this transition. Ooh, fade in. Cool. So I'm just going to jump in this real quick. We've been talking about Flexbox for the last couple weeks. And we spent 2 weeks looking at how Flexbox works with the whole container element. Flexbox is always this relationship between a container and then the elements inside, so the Flex container and the Flex items. And we spent a bit of time looking at the Flex container about how it works when it's in this horizontal or a row type orientation, and when it's in the vertical or column orientation, actually direction. Yeah, row direction or column direction. So we've done that, and we're going to come back now. We're going to take a look at the individual items and the properties that you can place onto the items inside of that Flex container. For simplicity, we're going to do it with a row direction. Stuff is going to work pretty similarly if you do it in a column direction. Maybe I'll play around with it, see if it's worth showing the demo again in that orientation. But I just tweeted out the link to this. I'll make sure it's in the notes on the YouTube as well. So let's dive in. So I broke this thing down into just 4 elements right now because I'm not really going to mess around with rows quite as much. So 4 helps us to kind of see this a little bit easier. You can see each one's slightly different amount of content. That number 2 is particularly small. So I'm going to be working on that and kind of explaining how this whole process works. For one, I guess that first question is, why is 2 so small? And part of it is the way that Flexbox works. What Flexbox does is it takes, since we're not wrapping, it takes everything that could fit into this box and gets the initial size of the item, like how big would this element be just by itself, and gets that value for all 4 of them. And seeing that they won't all 4 fit into this container, it starts shrinking them all down at the same rate. And because 2 is smaller, because it doesn't fill up that full length of the page, it actually shrinks down faster because it started off being smaller. We'll see a little bit of that as we go. But the first thing let's talk about order. So one of the amazing things with Flexbox is that you can actually change the order of elements on the page. And that's what this order property is all about. Now, again, I'm using auto prefixer, so definitely use that, or if you need some mix-ins or whatever, go ahead and do it. But this is, assuming that you're going to have all the different vendor prefixes for all the browsers that don't support it without a vendor prefix. So the way the order works, order is not a numerical like position, like position 1, 2, 3, or 4. It is a weight. It's a positive and negative weight. So anything that's 2 will be after a 1. Anything that's 1 will be before a 2. But it doesn't mean that you go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and that necessarily, like, that's how you have to do it. You certainly can, because 1 always comes before 2 and 2 always comes before 3. But as a start, everything is position 0, and that means that nothing has a weight to it. I can take this 2 and actually I can decrease the weight, and that brings 2 before all of the negatives, all of the all of the zeros. So everything is 0 except for the element 2, which is negative, which brings it down. So again, I can make this -5. It's not going to make any difference. So then let's take a look at this. Let's leave this at 0 for a second. We can take element 1, and remember, everything in this thing, all 4 of these are 0 at the moment. So if I take element 1 and say 1, it's actually going to shove it to the end. This is what I'm saying. It's not position. It's not position 1 or 2. So you won't go 2 and expect it to be the second element in the group. What 2 means is that it's going to come after any zeros or any 1s. So if I have element 2 and I make that into 1. You see element 2 is a weight of 1 and element 1 is a weight of 2. So 1 comes after 2. That's a lot of numbers, but you can see it right there. If I make them both the same, if I make them both the same weight, 2 is going to come after 1 because if they're the same weight, it just looks at the DOM order. So that's what it is. It's weight. It's not position. It's the weight of the element and how it relates to the rest of the element's weights within that stack. So again, the default weight for everything is 0. So it can move things down in the stack, move things up in the stack with either negative or positive numbers. And I don't really think there's any let's see. No, I haven't tried this. 1. Hey, look at that. So, I mean, you can do crazy numbers. I mean, you have tons of elements. You have to sort them and order them. You can get really granular with that. So that's how that works. Let's put them back to 0 so that we kind of, our brain doesn't play tricks on us in the positions here. And let's talk about the next property, which is flex shrink. So as I said, the way that, and let me just turn this off real quick. Let's turn off flex. The way that, what's the best way to explain this? So again, the way that it makes all 4 of these things fit into one box is it takes them as their base size. So what would they be by themselves if nothing else would there? And number 2 doesn't even fill the entire box. It's a little bit smaller. So it takes all those sizes and it starts with their base size. We're going to talk about flex basis in a little bit. And it works down from there. So it takes everyone's base size. Okay, you're this, you're this, you're this, you're this. And then as there's not enough room, it's going to take off size to make everything fit. So everything starts coming down, and I believe it's probably percentage based. So like reduce things 10%, reduce things 20%, reduce things 30% until everything fits in. And since 2 is smaller than the rest of its siblings, it actually gets reduced less. Or reduced to a smaller size. So the thing is, we can change that relationship because normally everything shrinks at the same rate, but we don't have to do that. We can say for element 2, let's not shrink at all. So if I do 2, this you can see it. 2 takes up that much space. So so since 2 doesn't fill up the whole size, it starts at a smaller piece, or a smaller size before it starts shrinking. So we can tell number 2 not to shrink at all, just to stay the size that it is. And again, this is default. So 1 is just the same as everything else. So it's kind of a ratio thing. 0 would be nothing at all. And then I can do like partials of that. So like 50%. Like, yeah, I want to shrink, but I don't want it to shrink as much as everything else. Which means when the size of this changes, like when I change this from 700 to say 900 pixels wide, it doesn't shrink as much or going the other way. You can probably see it better when it's dynamic. So it's only going to shrink half as much as everything else. So when everything else is shrinking 20%, that number 2 is only shrinking 10%, that kind of stuff. So we can change the flex shrink of a particular item. Now, again, of course, you can do in multiples of these. You can change lots of them, but I'm just focusing on number 2. So let's put that back at 1. So everything's shrinking at the same rate. All right, so now let's talk about flex grow. Flex grow goes in the opposite direction. Because of flex will automatically fit all your elements into a space, or it'll fill up the space that you have. So flex grow starts traditionally at 0. Basically, nothing grows. It's like my garden. Ka-ching. All right, I need to get some sound effects in here. Moving on. So let's start everything off with a width of 100 pixels. So I'm setting a width of 100 pixels. That's what everything starts at. And you see the flex shrink in this case isn't going to make a difference because in here, flex shrink, it doesn't need to shrink anything because it already fits in the space. But what I can do is say flex grow. So I can say like, hey, all right, everything's gonna be 100 pixels, but if you got extra space, let's go ahead and fill up that space. So let's go ahead and take just item number 2 and let's let that grow. Basically at 100%, it takes up all of the growing. And I think actually it's always gonna take up all of it unless I do this. Actually, this would be a good example. So let's do that at half and number 1 at half. So now you can see each element 1 and element 2 actually grow at the same rate. So they start at 100 pixels and they both are growing at the same rate. If I want to change that, I can say Nope, don't want to do that. If I want element 2 to actually grow at a faster rate, so now you can see the element 1 grows at half the rate that element 2 grows. So you see that 2 is going to be a little bit larger than 1. So you can do those kind of things. Again, it's the relationship between, like, this one grows, if there's an extra 10 pixels, actually let's say 15 pixels, then E2 gets 10 of them and E1 gets 5 of them. That's how that works. And then it keeps increasing until it fills its parent. This is really cool because this allows you, especially in vertical kind of stuff, and I'll certainly be showing off some of these demos later, that when you want to fill up space, when you want, like, you've got something at the top that we're going to talk vertical. So when you got something at the top that's a fixed height, you got something at the bottom that's a fixed height, and you want that thing in the middle just to fill up the space, that's exactly what FlexGrow is all about. So FlexGrow allows us to fill up that space in a controlled way, to take each individual element to say which element grows, which element doesn't grow, and also to say with shrink, which elements shrink and which ones don't shrink. So let's see if I can do this. Let's take off the grow. I'm going to get rid of this anyway for the rest of the demo. So if we're going to do a flex shrink, let's say element 2 does not shrink at all. And let's see if I can grab the edge of this browser. Actually, let's do 80% so I can actually make a change. So you see that element 2 is just going to stay the same size no matter what. And that's the power of this, is you can set that flex grow or the flex shrink of 0 on something, and it'll always stay the same size while everything else is changing size. So if you have a column, say you have an add column, which is like your right-hand column of your page, that needs to stay at 300 pixels. So those stupid Flash ads, can have the 300 pixels of space. You can give that a flex grow of 0, a flex shrink of 0, while everything else shrinks normally. That's the kind of power that Flexbox brings right out of the box. Really, really great. So let's move on to the next stuff. So we talked about flex shrink. We talked about flex grow. We've taken that off because the next thing I want to talk about is flex basis. So flex basis is very similar to the concept of just width. So if I have, let's take this off real quick, and I put a width here of 100 pixels. So everything's going to start at 100 pixels, and let's say 400. Maybe 800. So everything starts at 800. 1,000? I guess be there. Yeah, so everything starts at 1,000 pixels, and then it shrinks as it goes. And which means things are kind of the same size. I won't get into that math. It's probably crazy. Flex basis does the exact same thing. So if I want that flex basis 1,000 pixels here, I can get rid of width. And I can turn this on. And that does the same thing. It's like, where do these elements start? What size do they start at? So in this case, the width and flex basis do the exact same thing. So you're like, well, why do I need flex basis if I have width? Well, what happens when you have a column row direction? Well, now that flex basis of, I'll say 200 pixels so we can see it on the screen, that flex basis actually applies vertically. So flex basis is always going to go across the primary axis, whereas width is obviously going to always be a width. So it's a little bit smarter of a size. It's basically, what's my starting size along the primary axis versus width, which is just width. One other interesting thing to note, as we'll set this back to row, here we go, is that flex basis actually completely overrides width. So this is kind of expected, like, let's drop this down like 100 pixels or something. So you would expect things, you'd expect this, flex basis overrides the width, right? Because it's cascades. Well, no, actually, even if I move width afterwards, and I tested this just to make sure I wasn't going to surprise myself. Flex basis actually completely overrides that width. You can set this width at anything you want. You can probably throw an important Bing on there. It still doesn't do anything. Only by setting flex basis to 100 are you going to be able to change it. So that's really great because you can do floats, you can do widths, and all of that kind of stuff. And then if you throw Flexbox on it, it's going to override all that kind of stuff. And that's actually one other thing to note, that Flexbox also overrides floats. So this is actually kind of great, and we're going to talk about this in a little bit, in that if you have width and floats and all that kind of stuff in your layout, you can apply Flexbox to it and it just completely overrides all that, but gives you a good fallback. We'll talk about that again. I've got some great examples to show for it. But that's FlexBasis. It basically gives us that starting point. What's that size that everything starts at before it starts growing or shrinking, which is cool. So let's move on to the next. So the next one is this concept of flex. And this is just a shorthand method of saying flex grow, flex shrink, flex basis. And again, anyway, so if I don't want to do this, if I don't want to have 3 separate properties, there we go. Oops, 2 of them. I can go down here to flex and just say, I want this to grow. I don't want to shrink. And I want it to be like, let's say 400. I want a flex basis of 400 pixels. So you can just do it all within one property. It just makes it a lot easier, a bit less verbose. So that's cool. So let's move on to the last one here, which is align self. This is very, very similar to the align items that we had on the container. But instead of doing it on a global, across the board, align items, instead of stretch or flex, flex start. So you see we're going to be all doing... align items, not align content. Flex start. Yes, cool. So instead of doing it on everything, which the align items does, this allows you to set it on an individual basis. So we've got flex bottom, flex end. Let's try end. I've got it right above me. Crazy. We can do center and what we saw at first where we had stretch. So you can assign it at an individual level. So if you need, if you need the first one, everything to be, the first 2 to be center and the other 2 to be at the top, you can do whatever you want. You can just set individual ones for each one. And this is just great power. Like you don't have to do crazy weird CSS hacks or JavaScript or anything like that. You can set all these properties right within your flex item property setup. So that's basically it. That runs you through the properties of them in a really kind of short example. What we really are going to get into is start applying these to real world use cases, which is what we're going to start looking at. Probably not next week. I'm actually out of town next week, probably the week after. That'll give me time to kind of prep for some of these. But Flexbox is really powerful. There's a lot of instances where you can even apply it to your current traditional layouts that work in old browsers as well. And we're going to talk about some of those in the upcoming weeks. So hope you enjoyed this. Hope the camera stuff actually worked. And hopefully this actually recorded. Otherwise, I'm going to be going back and doing this some other time. And look for hopefully some more enhancements with this. And if you're curious about it, it's called Wirecast. It's actually something that YouTube recommended if you're doing, it's actually not on our Hangout. It's actually a YouTube live kind of thing. And maybe I'll even just do a quick podcast on that sometime explaining how that process works, because it's a pretty neat app that gives you some really nice professional-ish features without, it's actually a free app that has some professional tiers. So it might be a good chance to talk about that in the future. So let's see if I can find the button to say stop streaming. I think I found it. We'll see if it works, and we'll catch you in a couple weeks. Thanks. Bye.